There are so many different types of loops in JavaScript, from the for loop to the while loop to the do while loop, and even a few others you may not have heard of. So today's video, we're going to take a look at each one of them, and we're going to learn exactly what each one of them do. So what exactly is a loop, and why do we need them? Well, a loop is a way of quickly and easily repeating something until the loop is either broken or a specific condition is met where the loop is ended. But why exactly do we need them? Well, there's many different reasons that we would need to use a loop. Maybe we need to iterate over an iterable, such as an array or a string, or maybe we just need to repeat something multiple times until we get a desired result. Either way, there are many different loops for many different situations, and today we're going to go through each one of them and we can figure out which ones work best for which things. So let's go ahead and get started with the for loop. Now the for loop is a general purpose loop, and it's generally not specific to any one thing. We can use it for just about anything that we want. So to create our for loop, we're just going to say for, and then we're going to follow that up by opening and closing parentheses. And then after that, we're going to follow that up by opening and closing curly brackets. Now inside of these opening and closing curly brackets, we are going to put all of the code that we're going to be looping through. But more importantly is what goes inside of these opening and closing parentheses. These opening and closing parentheses need three specific things. We need an iterator, we need a condition, and we need an afterthought. And I'll explain everything right now. Now the iterator is a variable that generally stores the value or the current iteration of the loop. And generally we want to start this as something like 0. So we'd say let I equal 0, and this is going to be our starting point for our loop. I is going to be initially set to 0, and then after that we're going to put a semicolon, and this semicolon is very important so that way this loop doesn't break. And then after that we're going to put our condition. So we're going to say while I is less than 5, so currently I is set to 0, and as long as I is less than 5, this loop is going to continue. And then we also need another semicolon after that as well. And then we just need our afterthought, or some kind of step or degradation. So we could say I++, and this is generally how you would see a loop. Generally, it's going to have the iterator, the condition, and then you're going to have the afterthought or the step. So we could just say console.log inside of the loop. And if we save that, we're going to see inside of the loop printed out to the console. But we've got this 5 here. What is this 5? Well, this 5 is just representing the fact that we've done this exact thing 5 separate times. So we've logged out the exact same to the console 5 separate times. So whenever we go through this loop, it's going to start at 0, it's going to log out inside of the loop, and that's 1. And then after that, it's going to check this condition to see if it's still true. And if this condition is still true, it's going to run the loop again. And then it's going to continue that cycle until this condition is no longer true. So once I is actually equal to 5, 5 is no longer less than 5. That evaluates to false. So then this is going to break the loop. And this is just one simple way that we can use a for loop. Another different way we could use it is we could say I is now equal to 5. And then as long as I is greater than 0, we are going to take 1 away from I. So we're basically doing the exact same thing backwards here. So we're going to set I equal to 5, and then we're going to say as long as I is greater than 0, then we're going to continue with this loop, and then we're going to subtract 1 from I throughout every iteration. So if we save that, we can see we've got the exact same thing printed out to the console over here. But this is just one simple way that we can use loops. We can actually use these with arrays and other iterables as well. So let's say we want to iterate over an array. Let's go ahead and create our array. And I've already created a video on arrays. If you want to go and check it out, link is up in the cards. But we can create our array. We could say const array, and we could say array is this, and we can just put 1, 2, and 3, and 4 inside of the array. Now, how do we work with this array with a loop? How are we going to iterate over each one of these values inside of the loop? Well, let's just go ahead and remove all of this. We're just going to say let I equal 0 again. So we're going to start at 0, and then we're going to say as long as I is less than the array dot length. Remember, the array dot length, the length property is a value stored with the array. As long as I is less than the array dot length, then we're going to say I plus plus. And then we can go inside of here and we can say console.log, and we can say array index of I. So this may look a little weird at first, but let me explain it here. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to set I equal to 0. Then we're going to check our condition. Is I still less than the length of the array? And if it is, we're going to continue into the loop. Now, whenever we go into the loop, we're just going to log out the array, and we're going to search for the index that I currently is. So at the first iteration, I is going to be 0. So we're going to say array at index 0. And then once we get through that iteration, we're going to increase I to 1. Now I is checked to see if it is still less than the length of the array, and it should be. So then we're going to continue through this loop, and we're going to console.log array at index 1 now, and it's going to continue to go on that way until we reach the end where this is going to be false and it is no longer going to run the loop. And if we save that, we are going to see each value printed out to the console that is currently inside of this array. And this is how we can work with loops, and we can do this with other things as well, like strings. Now let's move on to our next type of loop, the while loop. And the while loop is very similar to the for loop, but it doesn't have all this extra stuff inside of the opening and closing parentheses. So let's go ahead and just comment this out, and we will put our while loop here. Now to create our while loop, we're just going to say while, and we're going to follow that up by opening and closing parentheses. And then after that, we're going to have open and closing curly braces, just like the for loop. But unlike the for loop, we're not going to have all this extra stuff inside of it. All we need inside of these opening and closing parentheses is the condition. But how are we going to break the loop if we don't have all this extra stuff? Well, there's a few ways that we could break the loop. Let's just go ahead and set it up like the for loop for now, and then later on I'll show you how you can utilize the while loop in different ways. So first off, we'll say let I equal 0, and this is going to be created outside of the while loop. And we're going to say while I is less than 5, we're going to console.log inside of the loop. And then how are we going to iterate I? Because we need to increase I so that this loop doesn't continue on forever. Because if we don't increase I, this loop is never going to be false. So the way that we could do that is pretty simple. We could just say I plus plus inside of the loop. And if we save this, you can see inside of the loop has printed out 5 separate times. And this is simply because we have I set to 0 initially. Then we go into the loop and we check to see if I is less than 5. It currently is, so we log it out. Then we increase I by 1, and we continue on 5 different times until I is no longer less than 5. Now I know what you may be thinking, why would I use the while loop or the for loop? They both look identical, they both do the exact same thing. How would I know which one I should be using? Well, a general rule is that you should use a for loop whenever you are looping through something a specific number of times, or you know the number of times that you're going to be looping through something, just like the array. We know the array is going to be looping through however many times the length of the array is. is. But something like a while loop you would generally use if you don't know the number of iterations that you're going to have. So something like a game. A game generally uses something like a while loop. Whenever you click start game, it's going to enter that while loop, and all kinds of different things are happening regardless whether you're moving or doing anything specific or not. It's still inside of that while loop, and things are still happening, things are still moving while you're still playing that game, regardless what you're doing. But we don't know how many times we're going to continue to loop through there. So we use a while loop. So while we're still playing the game, it's going to be true. And then whenever we quit the game, whenever we hit the quit game button, it's going to break out of that while loop, and it's going to enter the quit game segment rather than the while loop during the game. So now let's take a look at the while loop in a slightly different light, and this might make it shine just a little bit more. So let's go ahead and remove all of this, and we're going to remove this here. So let's say while I is not equal to -1. But how are we going to get to -1 if I never goes down to -1? Well, let's play it out here. So let's say console.log inside of the loop. And then let's just say I++. But instead of just stopping there, let's say if I times I is equal to 64, then we're going to say I is now equal to -1. And this is going to cause our loop to break. This is going to be our condition where the loop is going to break. So whenever we start this out, we're going to set it at 0, and it's going to continue to increment until this condition is met. And once this condition is met, and we all know I times I to make this true has to be 8. So I has to be equal to 8 to get to 64. But in general, this is a general sense of how you would create a while loop, that we don't know the exact number of iterations until it meets a specific condition to break the loop. So once this condition is met, then I will be set to -1 and the loop will be broken. So let's actually just console.log I as well after the loop so we can kind of see what's going on here. And if we save this, you can see we've got inside of the loop and then we've got 1. So we're going to say while I is not equal to -1, it's currently set to 0, then it's console logging this inside of the loop, this very first one. Then we're going to do our conditional check to see if this is true, which it is not. Then we're just logging out I, and we're going to continue that until we get to what looks like 8, because 8 times 8 is 64, so it meets this condition at 8, and then it sets I to -1, and we can see that here at the end where I is logged out as -1 right before the loop gets broken. Now there's one more slightly easier way that we can break out of a loop, and this is using the break statement. And this break statement, whenever we encounter the break statement, is going to break out of the loop immediately. It's not going to go back around and check to see if this is still true. It's going to break out of the loop immediately. And we can see this where it used to have the -1 down here at the end, where it would set it equal to -1 here, then it would log out that -1 as I, and then it would be broken out whenever this became false. That's no longer true because we're using the break statement, and it is breaking out right here. It's not even going to this line whatsoever. Now there is another type of loop, and this is the do while loop, and this loop is not personally one of my favorites, but it's very good to know that we have it just in case you want to use it or you need it. So let's go ahead and comment this all out here, and let's do the do, and we're going to put curly braces. So this is going to do something while something else is true. So this loop is going to run at least once before it even checks if the condition is true. So it's going to do this first, and then it's going to say while this is still true. So we're going to say console.log running inside of the loop. And then we can say while 5 is greater than 5. And if we save this, you're going to see that it's going to run once, and that's it, because 5 is never actually greater than 5. So this is going to immediately evaluate to false once this has already ran once. But we could also say let I equals 0, and then we can say do this, and then we're going to say I plus plus, and then we're going to say while I is less than 5. And if we save that, we get running inside the loop, printed out 5 different times, just like we did with this one and with this one. And we can also work with arrays with this one, just like we can with the other 2 loops as well. So if we uncomment this array up here, we can say do console.log array index I while I is less than array.length. And if we save that, we can see that we get 1, 2, 3, and 4 printed out to the console, and then it broke the loop once I became greater than the length of the array. Now there's actually another type of statement that we can use, and this is the continue statement. Now what the continue statement does is it's going to break the current iteration of the loop, so it's going to stop the current iteration and then it's going to start the loop back over. So if we can do this, we can say if I is equal to 2, then we're going to I plus plus, and then we're going to say continue. And what we need to do here, we need to increase the I inside of this loop, or else it's never going to increase. It's always going to just continue at 2. It's never going to actually increase. And if we do this, and then we just log out I, and then we say while I is less than 5, and if we save that, we can see we've got 0, 1, 3, and 4 printed out to the console. Yeah, we completely skipped 2 here because we checked to see if 2 is equal, or if I is equal to 2, then we increased I by 1, so now I is 3, and then we said continue. So it skipped this console log and this I++ here, then it went straight down to here to check to see if this statement is still true, and it was, so it continued on with the loop. And this only hit once it got to 2, and it just completely skipped 2 from logging it out to the console. And this is how you can use the continue statement, and it can be used in just about any other type of loop that you want. You can use it in the while loop or the for loop. It works the exact same way. Now, I want to talk about infinite loops for a second. So many people are afraid of infinite loops, afraid it's going to destroy something or break something. And don't be afraid of infinite loops. I mean, they suck, yes, of course, but your PC is not going to catch on fire if you create an infinite loop, and eventually at some point, no matter how careful or cautious you are going to create an infinite loop. And I'll show you an infinite loop right here. So if I just remove this I++ here, I'm going to create an infinite loop, and you can see up here that my browser continues to load and things are going to get slow, but it's not going to catch on fire. My PC's not going to catch on fire, or it's not going to explode or anything like that. It's just going to lag out my computer a bit. It might freeze my Chrome, whatever the case may be. They're not the end of the world, is what I'm trying to get here. So don't be afraid of them. If you think it might create an infinite loop, screw it, just do it. Just create it, and worst case scenario, you have to restart your browser. And that's about it. Yeah, that's all I have to say about infinite loops. They suck, but don't be afraid of them. They're going to happen no matter what. But now that I've restarted my browser because of the scary infinite loop, let's go ahead and look at another type of loop. And this is going to be the for of loop. And what this loop does is it works specifically with arrays. Just a quick editor's note here, this was explained very poorly. While the for of loop does work with arrays, it is not exclusive to arrays like I made it sound here. The for of loop is a simplified version of a standard loop, but it works with other things other than arrays like strings, maps, sets, node lists, collections, and any other type of iterables. The for in loop is specific to objects and will only work with objects, which allows you to have the same functionality as a standard loop, but with objects. So we could say for let value of array, and then we could say console.log value. And if we save that, we're going to get the values printed out inside of this array up here. And there's another type that works specifically with objects. So let's go ahead and create an object. So we could say const object is equal to a new object, and we could say name is Kyland, and we could say age is 54, and we could say is human is true. And then we could create a for let key in object, and then we can log out all of the different keys inside of that object. So we could say console.log key, and if we save that, we now have name, age, and is human. And this is how you can specifically work with object keys with the for in loop. And these values here, the value and the key variables, these are just basic variables. You can name these whatever you want. So I can name this key, and then I could say key here, and it's going to work exactly the same. And the same with value here. I could change that to value, and I could change this to value, and this will work exactly the same as well. These are just regular variables that we're creating inside of the scope of this for loop. Now I want to talk about nested loops and the way that nested loops work. So let's go ahead and comment this out here, and let's actually create a for loop down here. For let I equal 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus. And then we're going to console.log I. And then let's create another for loop inside of this one here. Now, we cannot actually use I. And remember, I is just a basic variable that is scoped to the inside of this for loop. So we can use I inside of here, but if we want to create another loop of its own, we're going to have to use another variable. And generally, you start with I, you go to J, and so on and so forth. So we'll say for let J equal 0, while J is less than 5, we're going to say J plus plus. And then let's just console.log J. Now, if I save this, what you're going to notice is a little weird. So you're going to see we get 0 for this one right here, and then we get 0 here for this one here, and then we get 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we go back to 1. So what is actually going on here? Why do we have all of these different numbers? They don't seem to have any kind of order. Well, what's happening here is we're starting this for loop here, and we're console.logging I. This is the very first 0 here. Then we're entering this for loop here, and we're console.logging J. And we're going to continue to loop through this entirely before we finish and go to the next iteration of the outer for loop. So you can see we get console.log J, which this is the first iteration of J, and this is J, this is J, this is J, and this is J. Then what's going to happen is we're going to end that loop once this turns false. Then we're going to loop back around to this outer loop, and we're going to do it again. So we're going to get the 1 value from here. Then we're going to enter this for loop again, and we're going to log out 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then we're going to do that same thing again until we get to the end of this outer for loop. Now, there is a way that we can break out of this, but it's not the way that you think. So let's say if J is equal to 2, then we're going to say, first of all, J plus plus, then we're going to say break. And if we save that, you're going to see something a little weird as well. You're going to see 0, and then 0, 1, 2, and then you're going to see that we're going to start back over at 1. So what is actually happening here? Well, what's actually happening here is when I get through this, we're going to get to this where it says J is equal to 2, and then it's going to break out of this loop only, and then it's going to go back to this outer loop here. And this is happening because the break statement only breaks out of the closest loop that it's currently in. So it's not going to affect this outer loop, it's just going to affect this inner loop, and it's only going to break out once J is equal to 2. So you'll never see J go above 2 here in the console. So you see I is set to 0 here, J is 0, J is 1, J is 2. Now we start back over in the outer loop with 1 here. Then we start over with the inner loop at 0, 1, and 2. Then we go back out to the outer loop, and so on and so forth. We can actually use this to break out of the inner loop, but we can never actually break out of the outer loop. And I should never say never, because there's actually a way to do it, and I'm going to show it to you right now. But before we do that, I don't actually need this J++ here. We would need that if we were using the continue statement, but we don't actually need that here. Now let's say whenever we get to I is equal to 2 inside of this inner loop, and yes, you can access I inside of this inner loop. That's why we actually had to use J instead of I. Once we get to I inside of this inner loop equaling 2, we want to completely break out of that outer loop as well. But how do we do that? Well, we're going to use what's called a labeled statement. So up here, we're going to create a label for this for loop. So we're going to say label, and then label, and then we're going to put a colon, and this just says unused label. Now, if I, after this break, say label, we want to break label, and if I save this, now we're going to be able to break out of this outer loop once I gets equal to 2. So you can see we got 0 for this one here, then we got 0 for this one, we go through 1, 2, 3, and 4, then we go again, 1, 0, J, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we get to 2. So once we get to 2, it's going to log out 2 here, and then it's going to start this loop, and it's going to log out J at 0 here at the bottom, and then it's going to see that this is actually true. I is currently equal to 2, so we're going to break, and then we're going to break out of this labeled statement here, and this label can be whatever you want. We could say outer, and we could say outer here, and it's going to work the exact same way. And you can do this for however many nested that you want. We could say this loop here is inner, and then we could say if J is equal to 3, then we're going to break inner. And even though just a regular break statement would work here, this label here will work just as well. Now, I don't want to leave anything out of this video that I can think of, and I just recently thought of something else that I wanted to share real quick. Now, if you've noticed throughout this entire video, I have used the let keyword for everything here, and there's a specific reason for that. Let is the perfect keyword for everything working with loops, at least whenever you're working with the I and J variables that you're using to determine whether the loop should be broken or not. And the reason for that is because if I were to use, let's say, const, I can never actually update if it's used with a const. So if I save this, we're not going to get the expected result here. Furthermore, we should never ever use var here either, because, and I will show you why, var is not a great idea to be used inside of loops, simply because you can never reuse the variable name again. Well, technically you can, but it's going to cause bugs and it's going to cause issues. So if I say console.log I out here, we can save this, and you can see at the end right here at line 52, we logged out 2, which is the last known value of I. But if I say let, and we save that, we're not actually going to get any value printed out on line 52 because there's actually no value for I. I is not technically defined according to the scope that this is currently in, and scope is a little bit out of the scope of this video, but what I'm trying to get at here is you should always use let whenever you're working with I inside of loops or J inside of loops. You should always use let, because var and const are always going to cause you issues no matter how you use them inside of this loop this way. And that is it for JavaScript loops. Now, we went over a whole lot of different stuff in this video, so if you don't understand anything, I encourage you to rewatch the video a couple of times and try it on your own. Trying these things really sets it in, really helps you to understand these things. And if you really need help, drop a comment down below. I'll answer any questions that you have. In the meantime, if you did like the video, make sure you slap a like on it. Check out the full playlist. Link is right next to me. Make sure you subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.